Solve it. I dare you. $1 million right here, right now, if you can." Arthur Pendelton sneered violently, throwing a red marker onto the marble floor. It clattered to a stop right next to a puddle of spilled wine. He leaned forward, his voice dripping with absolute venom. "But let's be brutally honest. A black waiter like you can barely read the dessert menu, let alone understand quantum cryptography." The billionaire paused, laughing, as he looked around the room for approval. "Why don't you fetch a mop instead? That's what your kind is actually built for." He pointed a manicured finger at the young man's chest. "I bet your entire bloodline combined hasn't seen $1 million. Go ahead, boy. Pick up the pen or get on your knees and clean my shoes like you're supposed to." The exclusive private dining room, filled with 50 of the world's most powerful billionaires, fell dead silent. Nobody dared to breathe. Marcus Vance, a 24-year-old in a wine-stained uniform, didn't flinch. He didn't cower. He simply bent down, picked up the marker, and stared at the massive glass whiteboard. In exactly 30 seconds, this uneducated waiter was about to dismantle a $2 billion empire and bring Silicon Valley's most arrogant tech mogul to his knees. You do not want to miss how this incredible story unfolds. Before we witness this ultimate act of justice, drop your current city and local time in the comments below. And make sure to subscribe to our channel so you never miss a powerful story like this. The Obsidian Club sat perched at the very pinnacle of San Francisco's skyline, a fortress of glass and steel, where the city's fog seemed too intimidated to touch the windows. It was an exclusive enclave, a place where the air itself felt heavy with the scent of old money, expensive cigars, and unchecked ambition. Membership was not merely a matter of wealth. It was a matter of lineage power, and the kind of influence that could shift global markets with a single whispered conversation. Inside the grand private dining room, 50 of the most powerful investors in the United States were gathered. The tables were dressed in pristine white Egyptian cotton. Crystal chandeliers cast a warm golden glow over plates of truffles and glasses of vintage champagne that cost more than most people earned in a month. Moving invisibly through this sea of billionaires was Marcus Vance. He was 24 years old, wearing the crisp white button-down shirt and black vest that marked him as part of the club's serving staff. To the men and women in the room, Marcus was not a person. He was a fixture, a ghost, whose only purpose was to ensure their glasses never went empty. They did not know that 3 years ago, Marcus was a prodigy walking the halls of the Massachusetts Institute of Technology. They did not know about his 70-cent notebooks filled with groundbreaking algorithms or how his professors had called him a once-in-a-generation mathematical anomaly. All they saw was a young black man carrying a tray. Marcus had not chosen this life out of a lack of ambition. He had chosen it out of love. When his mother was diagnosed with stage 4 renal failure, the medical bills had devoured their meager savings like a wildfire. With no insurance and no safety net, Marcus had done the only thing a devoted son could do. He packed his bags, left his full scholarship at MIT behind, and returned to California. Now he worked 80 hours a week, alternating between double shifts at the restaurant and late-night hours doing freelance coding, all just to keep his mother's dialysis treatments going. His brilliant mind, once entirely consumed by multidimensional equations and quantum theories, was now forced to memorize wine pairings and seating charts. The heavy oak doors of the dining room swung open, and the atmosphere in the room immediately shifted. Arthur Pendelton had arrived. At 58, Arthur was the CEO of Pendelton Cybernetics, a Silicon Valley titan known as much for his ruthless business tactics as his staggering arrogance. He walked with the swagger of a man who believed the earth spun solely for his convenience. Wearing a bespoke Italian suit that cost more than a luxury sedan, he commanded the room's attention instantly. He was here to pitch his magnum opus, a project that promised to revolutionize global cybersecurity. Marcus was standing near Arthur's reserved seat, carefully arranging the silverware. Without looking, Arthur snapped his fingers, a sharp, piercing sound that cut through the polite chatter. "You, boy, more water, and make sure it's actually cold this time," Arthur barked, not even glancing at Marcus's face. Marcus nodded slightly, his jaw tightening. "Right away, sir." He stepped forward to pour the ice water. As he did, Arthur suddenly shifted in his seat violently, throwing his arm back as he laughed at a joke made by a neighboring investor. His elbow collided hard with the tray Marcus was holding. A full, untouched crystal goblet of deep red Bordeaux wine toppled over. The dark crimson liquid splashed forcefully onto Marcus's pristine white shirt, blooming instantly like a massive bloody stain across his chest. The glass shattered against the marble floor. Marcus stepped back, his hands instinctively dropping to his sides. "I apologize, sir," Marcus said, keeping his voice carefully neutral, burying the deep humiliation that flared in his chest. Arthur slowly turned around. He looked at the shattered glass, then at the sprawling red stain on Marcus's chest, and finally his cold, piercing eyes locked onto Marcus's face. There was no apology in the billionaire's expression. Instead, a cruel, mocking smirk crept across his face. "Look at what you've done," Arthur said, his voice loud enough to draw the attention of the surrounding tables. "Clumsy and incompetent. Are you incapable of performing the simplest of tasks?" Before Marcus could speak, Arthur reached into his tailored jacket pocket. He pulled out a crisp $100 bill. With a theatrical flick of his wrist, he let the bill flutter through the air. It landed squarely in the puddle of spilled wine and shattered glass on the marble floor. "Pick it up," Arthur commanded, leaning back in his chair. "Go on. Get on your knees and pick it up." Marcus stared at the money floating in the red puddle. His fists clenched so tightly at his sides that his knuckles turned white. Arthur let out a dry, condescending laugh loud enough for the entire room to hear. "Go ahead, boy. Now your shirt matches the trash in your neighborhood. Pick it up and get out of my sight before I have management throw you out into the street where you belong." The surrounding billionaires chuckled softly, sipping their champagne entirely unbothered by the sheer degradation unfolding in front of them. Marcus stood frozen, the weight of the racial hostility and absolute injustice pressing down on his shoulders like a physical burden. He slowly lowered himself to one knee, the shattered glass crunching beneath his shoe, and picked up the soaked bill. Will Marcus survive this night of humiliation, or will the weight of the elite crush him completely? The humiliation burned in Marcus's chest like hot coals, but he forced his face to remain a mask of professional indifference. He retreated to the shadows of the dining room, retreating to a corner where a linen closet provided a brief sanctuary. He hastily tried to dab the massive crimson stain on his shirt with a wet towel, but the wine had set deeply into the fabric. He couldn't afford to lose this job. Not tonight. His mother's next hospital bill was due in exactly 3 days, and the numbers were unforgiving. He took a deep, shuddering breath, grabbed a mop and a bucket, and returned to the dining room floor to clean up the shattered crystal. By the time he returned, the room's attention had entirely shifted. The lights had dimmed, and a massive, custom-built glass whiteboard had been rolled to the center of the room. Arthur Pendelton stood in front of it, bathed in the glow of a spotlight, looking like a conquering emperor. "Ladies and gentlemen," Arthur announced, his voice echoing off the high ceilings, "the era of standard encryption is dead. Every firewall, every digital vault you currently rely on can be cracked by tomorrow's supercomputers. But tonight, I present to you the impenetrable future." He gestured grandly to the board. "I give you Project Titan, the world's first flawless quantum encryption algorithm. I am opening the floor for a $2 billion funding round tonight." A murmur of awe rippled through the audience. If Arthur's claims were true, he held the keys to the future of global digital security. Governments, militaries, and international banks would pay anything for this technology. Arthur uncapped a black dry erase marker. "Let me show you the beauty of absolute security," he said. He began to write. His hand moved swiftly across the glass, detailing the core mathematical architecture of the Titan algorithm. He wrote out complex matrices, sprawling stochastic calculus, and multidimensional arrays. The equations were so dense, so terrifyingly advanced, that most of the billionaires in the room simply stared in blind reverence. They didn't need to understand the math. They only needed to understand the profit. Near the back of the room, kneeling on the cold marble floor, Marcus dragged a damp rag over the last remnants of the spilled wine. As he squeezed the rag into the bucket, he happened to look up. His eyes locked onto the glowing glass whiteboard. For the past 3 years, Marcus's brain had been starved of high-level mathematics. He had spent his days calculating tips and his nights calculating medical debts. But looking at the board, the dormant, brilliant machinery of his mind violently roared back to life. He didn't just see numbers and symbols. He saw the underlying architecture, the skeletal structure of the algorithm. He saw the logic flowing like water through a complex system of pipes. And then his eyes caught it. It was buried deep within the third panel, tucked inside a recursive loop of the encryption key generator. A slight misalignment in the dimensional reduction phase. Marcus froze. He stopped breathing for exactly 3 seconds. No, he thought, his mind racing at 1,000,000 miles an hour. If you run the secondary factorization through that loop, it creates an infinite feedback error. It doesn't lock the data. It leaves the side door wide open. It was a fatal backdoor. The algorithm wasn't impenetrable. It was catastrophically flawed. A skilled hacker with enough processing power could exploit that specific recursive error and shatter the encryption in less than 5 minutes. Arthur Pendelton wasn't selling an impenetrable fortress. He was selling a house of cards for $2 billion. Marcus was so consumed by the sheer mathematical tragedy on the board that he didn't realize he had stood up. He didn't realize he had stepped forward, the dirty rag still clutched in his hand, his eyes wide as they traced the flawed matrix. He was staring directly at Arthur's masterpiece. Arthur, turning to address the crowd, caught the movement out of the corner of his eye. He stopped mid-sentence. The billionaire's gaze landed on the young black waiter with the wine-stained shirt standing awkwardly in the aisle staring at the board. The room fell silent as Arthur's expression darkened from professional charm to visceral disgust. "Excuse me!" Arthur barked, his voice sharp like a cracking whip. Marcus blinked, snapping out of his trance. He realized where he was. He realized who was looking at him. "What exactly are you staring at, boy?" Arthur demanded, taking a step toward Marcus. He crossed his arms, his lip curling into a sneer. "Are the shiny numbers confusing you? Or are you standing there trying to memorize my code so you can sell it for a bigger tip?" A few of the investors let out low chuckles. Marcus lowered his head respectfully, remembering his place, remembering his mother. "No, sir, I apologize. I was just looking at the matrix." "The matrix," Arthur mocked, rolling his eyes as he looked at the crowd. "Listen to him. The waiter knows the word matrix. Have you been watching sci-fi movies on your breaks, boy?" "No, sir," Marcus said quietly. He turned to walk away, desperate to de-escalate the situation. But Arthur wasn't done. He was a predator who had found an easy prey, and he wanted to entertain his guests. "Hold on," Arthur called out. "Don't run away. You were staring so intently. Tell me, boy in the dirty shirt, do you even know what numbers look like, or do they just look like a bunch of squiggly lines to someone of your background?" The blatant racism hung in the air, heavy and undeniable. Yet not a single one of the 50 billionaires in the room spoke up. They sat in their tailored suits and designer dresses watching the humiliation unfold as if it were a halftime show. Marcus stopped in his tracks. His jaw tightened so hard it ached. He looked back at Arthur, and for a fleeting second, the obedient waiter vanished, replaced by the MIT prodigy. "I know exactly what it says, sir," Marcus replied, his voice calm, steady, and dangerously clear. Will Marcus's daring response cost him his job? Or is this the beginning of Arthur Pendelton's ultimate downfall? The absolute audacity of Marcus's reply sent a shockwave of utter silence through the room. No one spoke to Arthur Pendelton that way, least of all a young black man wearing a stained uniform. Arthur's face flushed a deep, ugly red. The veins in his neck bulged as he prepared to unleash hell on the insubordinate servant. But before Arthur could utter a word, the heavy double doors at the back of the room burst open. Richard, the general manager of the Obsidian Club, sprinted into the room. Richard was an older black man who had spent 3 decades bowing his head, shrinking his presence, and doing whatever it took to keep the wealthy clientele happy. His face was slick with terrified sweat as he rushed toward Marcus, instead of defending his employee or pulling him away quietly. Richard chose to make a public sacrifice. He grabbed Marcus roughly by the arm and yanked him backward. Without warning, Richard slapped the back of Marcus's head, a sharp, demeaning strike that echoed in the quiet room. "What is wrong with you?" Richard hissed, his voice trembling with panic and misplaced anger. He pushed Marcus hard, trying to force the young man down. "Get on your knees! Apologize to Mr. Pendleton immediately, you uneducated fool! You don't know your place!" Marcus stumbled but caught his balance. He refused to kneel. He looked at Richard, feeling a deep, sickening sorrow. It was one thing to be degraded by a billionaire tyrant. It was another tragedy entirely to be betrayed by a man from his own community, a man so broken by the system that he would strike a younger brother just to appease a racist elite. "Richard, stop," Marcus said quietly, his voice carrying a tragic weight. "Shut up," Richard spat, turning to Arthur, and bowing deeply, his hands clasped together in supplication. "Mr. Pendleton, I am so deeply sorry. This boy is worthless. I'll have him fired and thrown out the back door this very second. Please forgive this interruption." Arthur held up a hand. The cruel smirk had returned to his face. The billionaire had tasted blood, and he wasn't about to let the game end so quickly. "No, Richard. Wait," Arthur said, his eyes locking onto Marcus with malicious glee. "The boy said he knows what the Matrix says. Let's test that arrogance, shall we? Let's have a little entertainment." Arthur turned back to his massive glass whiteboard. He grabbed the red marker and moved to a blank section of the board. With furious, heavy strokes, Arthur wrote out the foundational equation of the encryption's generation key, a monstrous, multi-layered problem involving nonlinear differential equations and complex topological mapping. It was a problem that had taken Pendleton's team of Ivy League engineers 3 weeks to verify. Arthur capped the marker and slammed it onto the tray. He reached inside his jacket and pulled out a leather-bound checkbook. With a gold fountain pen, he quickly scribbled across the paper, tore the check free, and slammed it down onto the nearest dining table. $1 million, Arthur declared, his voice ringing through the room. "I just wrote a check for $1 million payable to cash." The investors in the room murmured, leaning forward in their seats. Arthur pointed a finger at Marcus. "Solve it. I dare you. $1 million right here, right now, if you can solve that equation." Marcus stared at the board, then at the check. Arthur took a slow, deliberate step toward Marcus. He had done his homework on the club's staff. He knew how to twist the knife. "I hear you work double shifts, boy. I hear you've got a sick mother at home dying slowly because you can't afford her medical bills." Marcus's blood ran completely cold. The room seemed to tilt. "This $1 million," Arthur whispered loud enough for the microphone on his lapel to pick it up. could buy your mother a few more months on oxygen. It could pay off the hospital. But let's face the harsh reality, boy. Your inferior genetics aren't worth the effort to save. People like you don't possess the mental capacity to comprehend this board, let alone solve it. You are genetically destined to scrub my floors. A woman in a diamond necklace gasped softly, but no one intervened. Richard, the manager, kept his head bowed, too terrified to speak. "So here is my ultimatum," Arthur hissed, stepping back and crossing his arms. "Solve this equation. If you can't, and we all know you can't, you get on your knees, you apologize for daring to look at your betters, and you get thrown out of this city with nothing. No job, no money, nothing." The room fell completely silent. All 50 pairs of eyes turned to the black waiter in the ruined shirt. They waited for the inevitable. They waited for him to break, to cry, to run out of the room in absolute shame. But Marcus didn't run. He stood perfectly still. The insults about his mother, the racial slurs, the betrayal from his manager, they all coalesced into a cold, terrifying focus inside his mind. How will Marcus respond to the ultimate insult, and what will happen when he finally approaches the board? For what felt like an eternity, the grand dining room of the Obsidian Club was suspended in absolute suffocating silence. The air was thick, heavy with the toxic blend of extreme wealth, unchecked arrogance, and blatant racism. 50 billionaires sat perfectly still, holding their breath, waiting to see the final breaking point of a young man whose spirit had just been violently crushed. Richard, the terrified manager, tugged desperately at Marcus's sleeve. "Please, Marcus," Richard hissed, his voice trembling, barely a whisper. "Just get on your knees. Apologize. If you don't do this, they will destroy you. They will blacklist you from every job in this city. Think of your mother. Kneel." Arthur Pendelton stood a few feet away, his arms crossed over his tailored suit, a sickeningly triumphant smile plastered across his face. He thrived on this. He fed on the power of breaking people, of proving that his wealth made him a god among insects. To him, Marcus was not a human being. He was a prop, a momentary amusement to entertain the elite before getting back to the business of making billions. But Marcus did not kneel. Slowly, deliberately, Marcus turned his head to look at Richard. The fear that had briefly flickered in the young man's eyes was completely gone, replaced by a profound, chilling calmness. It was the look of a man who had suddenly remembered exactly who he was. Marcus gently but firmly grabbed Richard's trembling hand and peeled it off his sleeve. "I am not kneeling," Marcus said, his voice low, resonant, and entirely steady. "Not for him. Not for anyone in this room." A collective gasp rippled through the audience. A few investors shifted uncomfortably in their seats. Richard stumbled backward, his face draining of all color, realizing that he could no longer control the situation. Marcus took a step forward. He reached up and unbuttoned the top button of his ruined, wine-soaked uniform shirt. He pulled the service towel from his belt and dropped it onto the floor right on top of the spilled wine. With every step he took toward the front of the room, the subservient waiter vanished, and the MIT prodigy, the genius who used to map multidimensional algorithms in his sleep, stepped into the light. Arthur's smug smile faltered slightly as Marcus approached the massive glass whiteboard. "What do you think you're doing, boy?" Arthur snapped, his voice losing a fraction of its amusement. "I told you to get on your knees." Marcus completely ignored the billionaire. He didn't even look at the $1 million check sitting on the table. He stopped in front of the board, his eyes scanning the terrifyingly complex mathematical problem Arthur had designed to humiliate him. To the billionaires in the room, the equation was an alien language. But to Marcus, it was a familiar melody, an intricate puzzle just begging to be unlocked. Without hesitation, Marcus reached out and picked up the red marker resting on the aluminum tray. He popped the cap off. The sharp chemical smell of dry erase ink filled the air. He raised his hand and pressed the tip of the red marker to the glass. And then he began to write. His hand moved with blinding speed and absolute precision. There was no hesitation, no pausing to calculate in his head. The numbers and symbols flowed from the red marker like a cascading waterfall. He began to deconstruct Arthur's nonlinear differential equation, stripping away the foundational layers of the cryptography model. Clack, clack, squeak. The sound of the red marker hitting the glass echoed sharply in the cavernous room. Marcus's handwriting was immaculate, structured, and deeply elegant. He was not just solving the problem, he was exposing its internal anatomy. He pulled the stochastic variable out of the nested integral, a move so advanced it defied standard mathematical logic, and rewrote the boundary conditions. Behind him, the room remained paralyzed in shock. Arthur Pendelton's arms slowly uncrossed. He took a step forward, his eyes narrowing, trying to make sense of what he was seeing. At first, Arthur assumed the boy was just scribbling gibberish, trying to put on a brave face before security dragged him out. But as Marcus moved to the second line, and then the third, Arthur's breath caught in his throat. The math was real. It was flawless. "Wait," Arthur muttered under his breath, his heart suddenly hammering against his ribs. "What is he doing? That's impossible." Marcus didn't stop. The red ink stretched across the board, forming a beautiful, terrifyingly accurate web of advanced calculus. He was breaking down the quantum matrix, bypassing the artificial barriers Arthur's team of Ivy League PhDs had spent weeks building. The billionaire elite watched in stunned fascination. The waiter they had laughed at, the boy they had deemed genetically inferior, was dismantling a $2 billion algorithm with the ease of a master pianist playing a simple scale. Will Arthur accept this devastating display of intellect, or will he resort to drastic measures to stop the truth from being exposed? As Marcus's hand flew across the glass, leaving a trail of brilliant red equations in its wake, the atmosphere in the room shifted from stunned amusement to absolute, unadulterated shock. The wealthy investors, hedge fund managers, and venture capitalists leaned forward, their expensive champagne forgotten. They didn't understand the complex topology being written on the board, but they understood the universal language of panic, and Arthur Pendelton was radiating it. Sitting at the very front table was Dr. Elias Thorne. At 65, Dr. Thorne was not just an investor. He was a living legend in the academic world. He was a former head of cryptography at the National Security Agency and a current professor emeritus at Stanford University. He had been invited tonight specifically to validate Arthur's claims. As Marcus reached the fourth line of the equation, Dr. Thorne's eyes widened behind his wire-rimmed glasses. His hand holding a crystal glass of water began to tremble. He slowly set the glass down before he dropped it. "My God," Dr. Thorne whispered to himself, leaning so far forward he was practically at the edge of his seat. The woman sitting next to him, a venture capitalist from New York, frowned. "Elias, what is he doing? Is he just drawing nonsense?" "No," Dr. Thorne replied, his voice breathless with awe. "He isn't drawing nonsense. He's applying a localized manifold dimensional reduction. He's mapping the nonlinear variables into a secondary metric space to bypass the recursive loop. It's breathtaking." "Is that good?" she asked, thoroughly confused. "It's not just good," Dr. Thorne said, his eyes glued to the young black man in the wine-stained shirt. "It's a technique I've only ever seen theorized in obscure high-level academic papers. Only a handful of mathematicians on the planet possess the cognitive architecture to execute a calculation like this in real time." Up on the stage, Arthur Pendelton felt the floor crumbling beneath his bespoke Italian shoes. His multi-billion-dollar empire, his reputation, His absolute superiority, everything was unraveling at the hands of a kid he had just humiliated for sport. Arthur's face turned a violent shade of purple. The illusion of his absolute control shattered. He couldn't let this continue. If Marcus solved the equation, if he proved the algorithm was comprehensible, the myth of the impenetrable Titan project would be destroyed. "Stop!" Arthur shouted, his voice cracking with desperation. He lunged forward, pointing a trembling finger at Marcus. "Stop writing immediately. You are vandalizing my property." Marcus didn't flinch. He didn't even pause. His focus was absolute, his hand continuing to write out the elegant red mathematical truths. "Security!" Arthur screamed, turning toward the heavy doors at the back of the room. Spit flew from his lips. "Security, get in here now! Grab this street thug! He's trying to steal my proprietary data! Get him out of my sight!" Two massive security guards in black suits burst through the doors, their heavy footsteps echoing against the marble floor. Richard, the manager, scurried behind them, pointing frantically at Marcus. "Get him! Pull him away from the board!" The guards rushed down the center aisle, their hands reaching out to grab Marcus by the shoulders and physically drag him out of the room. The investors gasped, some pulling back in their chairs to avoid the impending violence. But before the guards could lay a single finger on Marcus, a booming, authoritative voice echoed through the room. "Stand down!" It was Dr. Elias Thorne. The legendary cryptographer had stood up, his chair scraping loudly against the floor. He stepped directly into the aisle, blocking the path of the security guards. Despite his age, there was a commanding, immovable presence about him. Arthur stared at him in disbelief. "Elias, what are you doing? This boy is insane. He's ruining the presentation." "He is doing exactly what you challenged him to do, Arthur," Dr. Thorne said, his voice cold and cutting. He turned his piercing gaze to the security guards. "If you touch that young man before he finishes his calculation, I will personally ensure that every single investor in this room pulls their funding from this project immediately. You will all be financially ruined." The threat was absolute. The security guards froze, looking uncertainly at Arthur, then at Dr. Thorne, and finally stepping back. In this room, money was the ultimate law, and Dr. Thorne commanded the respect of every wallet present. Arthur looked around wildly, seeking an ally, but the 50 billionaires were now entirely captivated by the drama unfolding on the board. The power dynamic had completely shifted. Arthur was no longer the brilliant tech titan dictating the future. He was a panicked, desperate man trying to silence the truth. Dr. Thorne turned his attention back to Marcus, his eyes shining with profound academic respect. The stain on Marcus's shirt no longer mattered. His job title no longer mattered. In that moment, the only thing that existed was raw, undeniable genius. "Let him finish," Dr. Thorne commanded the room, his voice dropping to an awed whisper. "Let the boy finish." What exactly will Marcus reveal on that board, and how will it destroy a $2 billion lie? The silence that followed Dr. Thorne's command was absolute. It was the kind of silence that presses against the eardrums, heavy and electric. The only sound in the entire grand dining room was the sharp, rhythmic squeak of the red marker gliding across the glass. 25 seconds. Marcus's breathing was slow and measured. The insults, the spilled wine, the crushing weight of his mother's medical debts, they all faded away, consumed by the pure, undeniable logic of the mathematics. He was operating in a state of flow, a cognitive hyperdrive where numbers spoke louder than any human voice. He reached the final tier of Arthur's highly guarded equation. This was the core engine of Project Titan, the mechanism that supposedly randomized the encryption keys, rendering them unbreakable. Arthur's PhDs had hidden this mechanism behind layers of complex, deceptive variables, assuming no one would ever have the mental capacity to strip it bare in real time. They were wrong. 28 seconds. Marcus simplified the final nested matrix. He isolated the prime generation coefficient, the beating heart of the $2 billion algorithm. As he wrote the final variable, a grim realization washed over him. The algorithm wasn't just flawed. It was structurally catastrophic. 30 seconds. Marcus brought the marker down hard, drawing two thick, decisive red lines underneath a single specific coefficient at the bottom right corner of the board. He capped the marker. The sharp click echoed like a gunshot in the silent room. He stepped back slowly, lowering his arm. For a moment, he just stared at the board, letting the mathematical reality settle over the room. Then very calmly, Marcus turned around to face Arthur Pendelton and the 50 most powerful investors in Silicon Valley. His posture was perfectly straight. The massive red stain on his white shirt looked less like a mark of humiliation and more like a badge of honor, a testament to the fire he had just walked through. "I have solved it," Marcus said. His voice was not loud, but it carried to the very back of the room, unwavering and terrifyingly clear. Arthur Pendelton swallowed hard, his throat suddenly bone dry. He looked at the board, trying desperately to find a mistake, a miscalculation, a misplaced decimal. But the math was staring back at him, beautiful, merciless, and completely correct. Marcus locked eyes with Arthur. "And in solving it, Mr. Pendelton, I have found something very interesting." You don't know what you're talking about," Arthur stammered, his usual baritone voice reducing to a pathetic rasp. "You're a waiter. You just memorized some parlor trick." Marcus didn't raise his voice. He didn't need to. He simply pointed to the coefficient he had double underlined. "Your matrix is fundamentally flawed," Marcus announced to the room, switching effortlessly into high-level technical English. "The encryption generation key relies on a symmetric sequence factorization. You claimed this makes it impenetrable. But right here," he tapped the glass, "you failed to account for the asymmetric decay in the quantum state. This creates an infinite recursive loop." The investors stared, completely silent, hanging on to his every word. "In plain English," Marcus continued, his eyes sweeping across the crowd, "this algorithm contains a massive backdoor. It doesn't lock the data. If a hacker inputs a simple destabilization sequence, the recursive loop will force the algorithm to vomit out its own encryption key." A collective murmur of shock ripped through the tables. "This isn't a vault," Marcus declared, staring dead into Arthur's panicked eyes. "It's a glass house with the front door left wide open. Any competent hacker with a decent processor could break into this system in exactly 5 minutes. If governments or banks implement Project Titan, their entire digital infrastructure will be compromised on day one." "Liar!" Arthur screamed, his voice cracking violently. He slammed his fists onto the table, his face contorted in absolute rage. "He's a liar. He's making it up. It's technical jargon meant to scare you. My team of Ivy League engineers spent 18 months on this." "Then your team of Ivy League engineers just wasted 18 months of your life," Marcus replied smoothly. Dr. Elias Thorne, who had been studying the board intensely, finally spoke. His voice cut through Arthur's hysterical denial. "He is not lying," Dr. Thorne said quietly. The entire room turned to look at the legendary cryptographer. Dr. Thorne stood up, walked slowly to the glass board, and traced Marcus's red lines with his finger. "The dimensional reduction is flawless," Dr. Thorne murmured almost to himself. He turned to face the investors, his expression grave. "The boy is absolutely correct. The recursive loop is hidden deep within the stochastic calculus, but it is there. A catastrophic vulnerability. If we had funded this, if we had deployed this technology, it would have been the greatest cybersecurity disaster in human history." Dr. Thorne turned his cold gaze to Arthur. "Your $2 billion project, Arthur, is worse than useless. It is a digital death trap." Chaos erupted. The 50 billionaires at the tables suddenly exploded into a frenzy of panicked whispers and shouted conversations. Cell phones were pulled out. Messages were frantically typed to financial advisors. "Cancel the wire transfer," a venture capitalist from New York shouted into his phone. "Pull our entire allocation from Pendleton Cybernetics immediately," a woman in the front row demanded to her assistant. Arthur Pendelton stood frozen in the center of the storm, watching his empire burn to the ground in real time. The invincible billionaire, the man who had mocked a black waiter's intelligence and genetics just 10 minutes ago, was now crumbling into absolute ruin. But Arthur was a cornered animal, and a cornered animal is always dangerous. As the reality of his total destruction set in him, a new dark realization dawned in Arthur's eyes. He looked at Marcus, his breathing ragged, his mind connecting a horrifying dot. How will the desperate billionaire counterattack? And what shocking truth is about to be revealed about Marcus's true identity? The immediate aftermath of Dr. Elias Thorne's devastating proclamation felt like a vacuum had suddenly sucked all the oxygen out of the grand dining room. 50 of the most influential billionaires in the country, individuals who usually dictated the flow of global economies with a single phone call, were now scrambling in blind panic. The myth of Project Titan, the supposed impenetrable digital fortress, had been shattered into a million irreparable pieces by a 24-year-old waiter in a ruined, wine-soaked shirt. Arthur Pendleton's face had drained of all its color, leaving him looking like a hollow, terrified ghost. His heart hammered violently against his ribs, a frantic, syncopated rhythm of absolute ruin. Everything he had built, the $2 billion valuation, the media hype, the sheer arrogance that fueled his daily existence, it was all evaporating right in front of his eyes. But Arthur was not a man who accepted defeat gracefully. He was a Silicon Valley predator, a man who had clawed his way to the top by destroying anyone who stood in his path. As the panic in the room swelled, the paralyzing fear inside him rapidly mutated into blinding, irrational rage. "Silence!" Arthur screamed, his voice cracking, echoing harshly against the crystal chandeliers. "Everybody stop! Do not touch your phones! Do not cancel those transfers! Boo-boo! So-boo!" No one listened to him. The venture capitalists were already speed-dialing their compliance officers, their voices overlapping in a chaotic symphony of wealth preservation. Arthur's eyes darted wildly around the room before locking onto Marcus. The young man stood calmly near the glass whiteboard, his posture unwavering, his expression a mask of absolute tranquility. The sight of that calm, dignified face drove Arthur past the point of sanity. "You!" Arthur bellowed, lunging forward, his bespoke Italian suit jacket flapping wildly. He pointed a trembling, manicured finger directly at Marcus's face. "You are a fraud. You are a filthy, lying little thief." Marcus did not step back. He met Arthur's furious gaze without a single flinch. "The math doesn't lie, Mr. Pendleton. Your algorithm is compromised." "Math? You didn't do that math!" Arthur shrieked, spit flying from his lips. He turned frantically to the crowd, waving his hands like a madman trying to conduct a derailed train. "Listen to me, look at him. He's a waiter. He's a nobody. He doesn't have the mental capacity to calculate a restaurant tip, let alone a quantum metric space. He cheated." Dr. Thorne stepped forward, his expression hardening into one of profound disgust. "Arthur, stop this madness. You are embarrassing yourself. The boy solved the equation right in front of our eyes." "He had an earpiece!" Arthur screamed, desperately abandoning all logic. He rushed toward Marcus, raising his hands as if to physically assault the young man and check his ears. "Someone fed him the answers, corporate espionage. A rival firm sent him here to sabotage my pitch. He's a corporate spy planted by my competitors." Marcus smoothly sidestepped Arthur's frantic grasp, moving with a quiet, dignified grace that made the billionaire look entirely pathetic. No one fed me anything, Marcus said, his voice cutting through the noise like a cold blade. I didn't need an earpiece to see that your 18 months of groundbreaking research is nothing but a patched-together derivative of pre-existing theories. Arthur, gasping for breath, spun around and looked at the dining table where the $1 million check still sat. His eyes widened. If the boy was a fraud, the bet was void. He lunged for the table, his fingers clawing desperately at the heavy paper. He grabbed the check, intending to rip it to shreds to destroy the evidence of his humiliating defeat. But before Arthur could tear the paper, a firm, heavy hand clamped down on his wrist. It was Arthur Keene, the senior legal counsel for the largest venture capital firm in the room. Keene was a towering man with a reputation for being entirely devoid of emotion. I wouldn't do that if I were you, Arthur. Keene said, his voice low, steady, and terrifyingly calm. Let go of me, Arthur hissed, trying to yank his arm away, but Keene's grip was like iron. It's my money. The boy is a fraud. The boy, Keene corrected sharply, just saved my firm $500 million. And more importantly, Arthur, this entire presentation is being recorded by the club's high-definition security cameras, including audio. Keene gestured toward the ceiling, where a sleek black camera lens blinked with a tiny red light. Arthur froze, the blood draining from his face once again, as he looked up at the camera. You made a verbal contract witnessed by 50 individuals and recorded on video. Keene continued, his voice dripping with legal finality. You offered him $1 million to solve the equation. He solved it. Dr. Thorne, the foremost expert in this room, verified it. If you tear up that check, you are committing a breach of contract, and I will personally see to it that this young man gets pro bono representation to sue you for 10 times that amount. Arthur's hand trembled. The check remained intact, clutched in his sweaty fingers. He was trapped. The billionaire bully had finally been backed into a corner with absolutely no way out. He's a nobody, Arthur whispered, his voice trembling with a mixture of hatred and despair. He looked at Marcus, his eyes wide with desperate confusion. How could a waiter know this? Who the hell are you? Who the hell are you? Arthur Pendelton's voice cracked, echoing loudly in the tense, hushed atmosphere of the grand dining room. The arrogance that had defined his entire life was completely gone, replaced by a frantic, pathetic need to understand how he had just been dismantled by a man wearing a waiter's vest. All eyes turned to Marcus. The 50 billionaires, the senior legal counsel, the legendary cryptographer, Dr. Thorne, and the terrified restaurant manager, Richard, all waited in breathless silence. They were looking at the young black man not as a servant, but as an absolute enigma, a genius disguised in plain sight. Marcus stood calmly by the whiteboard. Slowly, methodically, he raised his hand and began to wipe the smudges of bright green ink off his fingertips with his thumb. He didn't rush. He let Arthur stew in his own desperate silence. You asked me if I could read the menu. Marcus finally spoke, his voice steady, carrying a quiet, commanding authority. You told me that my kind couldn't comprehend numbers. You mocked my sick mother, and you told me my genetics were inferior. Arthur swallowed hard, taking a slight step back. The words repeated back to him now sounded not like boasts of power, but like the nails being driven into his own coffin. But you see, Mr. Pendleton, Marcus continued, tossing the green marker onto the tray, the matrix on this board, the dimensional reduction theory you claim your Ivy League team invented. They didn't invent it. Arthur's eyes darted nervously. What are you talking about? It's proprietary. We patented it. You patented a stolen framework, Marcus corrected him smoothly. 6 months ago, an anonymous author published a highly theoretical open-source paper on an obscure academic forum. The paper outlined a theoretical model for mapping non-linear stochastic variables in quantum encryption. The author went by the initials M.Vi. Dr. Elias Thorne gasped aloud. MV. The elderly professor took a step forward, his eyes wide with absolute astonishment. The MV manuscript, good God! That paper has been circulating through the highest levels of the NSA. We've been trying to track down the author for months. The mathematics in it were revolutionary. Yes. Marcus nodded respectfully to Dr. Thorne. It was revolutionary, but it was incomplete. The author specifically left a recursive loop, a back door in the final equation, because the paper was meant as a theoretical warning about quantum vulnerability, not a functional product. Marcus turned his cold, piercing gaze back to Arthur. Your team of PhDs found that paper, Mr. Pendleton. They didn't understand the math deeply enough to see the deliberate flaw. They just saw a brilliant equation, stole it, slapped your logo on it, and tried to sell it for $2 billion tonight. Arthur's jaw dropped. He tried to speak, but no words came out. The venture capitalists in the room began muttering angrily the word fraud, bouncing off the walls. How could you possibly know that? Arthur whispered, his voice trembling with the realization of his impending doom. Marcus reached into his pocket and pulled out his phone. The screen was cracked, a sharp contrast to the immense wealth surrounding him. He tapped a few buttons and held the screen up. It displayed the original source code, the timestamps, and the original draft of the MV manuscript. Because I am MV, Marcus said clearly. My name is Marcus Vance. The room erupted. The revelation hit the crowd like a physical shockwave. The brilliant, elusive mind that the NSA and Stanford had been hunting for was standing in front of them, wiping green ink off his hands, wearing a shirt ruined by spilled wine. 3 years ago, Marcus continued, his voice rising just enough to cut through the noise. I was a junior at MIT. I was on a full academic scholarship, double majoring in applied mathematics and quantum cryptography. But then my mother got sick. Stage 4 renal failure. The medical bills piled up. I didn't have a trust fund, Mr. Pendleton. I didn't have billions in the bank. So I dropped out. I came home. I took double shifts carrying plates to keep her alive. He took a step toward Arthur, who now looked visibly shrunken, his shoulders hunched, his eyes darting frantically for an exit. You looked at my skin, you looked at my uniform, and you assumed I was nothing, Marcus said, his voice filled with a powerful, righteous fire. You thought my poverty was a sign of intellectual inferiority. But the truth is, the only reason you even have a product to pitch tonight is because you stole it from the notebook of a black waiter from Oakland. Arthur Keene, the senior legal counsel, stepped forward again. He didn't look at Arthur Pendelton with anger. He looked at him with the cold, calculating detachment of a man observing a corpse. Mr. Pendleton, Keene said smoothly, as of this moment, my firm is officially withdrawing all funding. Furthermore, I will be forwarding this video along with Mr. Vance's testimony to the Securities and Exchange Commission tomorrow morning. Attempting to defraud investors with stolen, compromised technology is a federal offense. Arthur Pendleton's legs finally gave out. He stumbled backward, collapsing into one of the empty dining chairs. His hands went to his head, pulling at his hair. The arrogant, untouchable billionaire was gone, replaced by a broken, terrified man facing federal prison. Keene reached out, grabbed the $1 million check from Arthur's limp fingers, and walked over to Marcus. I believe this belongs to you, Mr. Vance, Keene said, handing the check over with a respectful nod. Marcus took the crisp piece of paper from the lawyer's hand. He looked down at the staggering number written across it, $1 million. It wasn't just money. It was oxygen. It was a new kidney for his mother. It was the end of 80-hour work weeks, the end of the crushing debt, and the end of his invisibility. He folded the check carefully and slid it into his pocket. The dining room, once a sanctuary for Arthur Pendleton's ego, had transformed into a courtroom of his destruction. The billionaires were actively packing up their briefcases, whispering aggressively to their assistants, severing all ties with Pendleton Cybernetics. Within 24 hours, the company's stock would plummet to absolute zero. Marcus looked down at Arthur, who was still slumped in the chair, staring blankly at the marble floor. There was no need for Marcus to hurl insults, no need to kick a man who had entirely destroyed himself. Silence was the ultimate victory. Slowly, Marcus reached up and untied the knot of his black serving apron. He pulled it over his head, the fabric heavy and stained with the crimson wine Arthur had intentionally thrown on him. He folded it once, stepped forward, and dropped the ruined apron directly onto Arthur's lap. "Clean up your own mess, Arthur," Marcus said quietly. Arthur didn't move. He didn't speak. He just sat there staring at the stained cloth, the physical symbol of his own catastrophic arrogance. Marcus turned to leave, walking down the center aisle. The investors, the very people who had laughed at him and ignored him just 30 minutes prior, now parted like the Red Sea to let him through. They looked at him with a mixture of profound awe, respect, and deep embarrassment. Richard, the terrified manager who had slapped Marcus, stood near the exit doors, his face pale and slick with sweat. He looked at Marcus, his lips trembling, trying to formulate an apology. Marcus didn't even acknowledge him. He walked right past Richard, leaving the cowardly manager to stew in his own irrelevance. Before Marcus could push through the heavy oak doors, a voice called out to him. "Marcus, wait!" Marcus stopped and turned around. Dr. Elias Thorne was jogging down the aisle toward him, clutching his briefcase. The legendary cryptographer stopped in front of the young man, panting slightly, his eyes shining with pure excitement. "Marcus," Dr. Thorne said, catching his breath, "what you did tonight, it wasn't just brilliant. It was historic. The academic world needs you. The industry needs you." Marcus offered a small, exhausted smile. "Thank you, Dr. Thorne. But right now I just need to get to the hospital and pay my mother's bills." Of course, of course." Dr. Thorne nodded vigorously. He reached into his jacket and pulled out a thick, embossed business card. He pressed it firmly into Marcus's hand. "When the dust settles, Marcus, I want you to call me. I am the director of the Advanced Cryptography Research Center at Stanford. I am officially offering you a full-ride scholarship to finish your degree, along with a position as a senior research fellow in my lab. You will have a team, a salary, and the resources to build your algorithms properly." Marcus looked at the card, then up at the elderly professor. For the first time all night, the heavy armor around his heart cracked, and a genuine wave of emotion washed over him. The years of struggle, the sacrifices, the relentless exhaustion, it was finally over. "I will," Marcus said, his voice thick with gratitude. "Thank you, sir." Dr. Thorne smiled warmly. "No, Marcus, thank you. Now go take care of your mother." Marcus turned and pushed open the heavy oak doors, stepping out of the suffocating world of the Obsidian Club and into the cool, crisp night air of San Francisco. He took a deep breath, looking up at the stars. He was no longer a waiter. He was no longer invisible. He was Marcus Vance, and his life had just truly begun. Over the next few weeks, the fallout was biblical. The SEC launched a massive federal investigation into Pendleton Cybernetics. Facing multiple charges of fraud and corporate theft, Arthur Pendelton was forced to step down as CEO. His net worth evaporated as investors fled, leaving him bankrupt, disgraced, and facing years in federal prison. Meanwhile, Marcus's mother received the transplant she desperately needed, her medical debts wiped clean by a single check. Marcus accepted Dr. Thorne's offer, returning to the academic world, not as a struggling student, but as a recognized genius who had exposed one of the greatest technological frauds of the decade. True brilliance and human dignity are never defined by the neighborhood you come from, the color of your skin, or the uniform you wear. Arrogance is a fragile glass house, and those who attempt to build themselves up by crushing others will inevitably be shattered by the very truth they tried to suppress. Never underestimate the quiet genius working in the shadows. If Marcus's incredible journey inspired you, drop a comment below sharing a time when someone underestimated you and you proved them wrong. Don't forget to hit that subscribe button for more powerful, triumphant stories of justice. Until next time, stay strong and never let anyone tell you your worth.